Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Thanks very much to all of you for joining us and to the Commonwealth Club for hosting this conversation. Someone myself who grew up in the Bay Area on a steady diet of public radio, I've had Commonwealth Club in my ears for a long time, and so it's quite an honor to be hosting this one. My name is Matt Sheehan, and I'm a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where my research focuses on China's technology ecosystem, in particular artificial intelligence. Before that, I lived and worked in China for about 5 years, including as a foreign correspondent. And it's when I came back from China for the first time back in 2016 that I had a chance to meet our speaker here tonight, and that's Brian Wong. Brian is a longtime senior executive at Alibaba, and he's the author of a wonderful new book entitled The Tao of Alibaba: Inside the Chinese Digital Giant That Is Changing the World. So Brian was the first American and only the 52nd employee at Alibaba Group. That's way back in 1999 when it was just a little known startup. And over the course of his sort of 16-year tenure at the company, he held a lot of positions and took on a lot of major projects, mostly in the international initiatives, including acting as a special assistant to the Alibaba founder, Jack Ma. That work took him all over Asia, India, Europe, the United States, where he helped expand Alibaba's business and build stuff like the Alibaba Global Initiatives and the Alibaba Global Leadership Academy. Brian is also the founder and chairman of Radii, a digital media company that bridges and remixes Eastern and Western cultural trends in everything from hip hop to the history of paper lantern making in China. So I first met Brian when he was preparing to found Radii, and we talked a lot about creating spaces where people in China and the United States could actually come to understand each other, maybe even to empathize with each other, and to just get a really sort of grounded set of insights into the other country and the other culture. And I'm very happy to say that I think Brian has achieved that kind of cultural bridging with his new book, The Tao of Alibaba. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Brian for some opening remarks on the book, followed by a Q&A that will be moderated by me. But if you're watching along with us, please put your questions and comments in the text chat on YouTube, and we'll be getting to them later in the program. So over to you, Brian.
Hey, thanks so much, Matt. And thank you to the Commonwealth Club for this invitation to share some thoughts about the Tao of Alibaba, but also the larger topic of sort of technology and this nexus of China and the United States. It's a great honor to be able to have this conversation and, to kind of just get into the highlights of the book itself. Matt, I know you're a native Palo Altan, and it's great to reconnect. And just like yourself, I grew up in the Bay Area, grew up in Palo Alto as well. I think both of our fathers are actually professors, if I recall. And we both ended up in China. So, the Tao of Alibaba is really an effort on my part to, as you mentioned earlier, to try and bridge some understanding between the East and West vis-a-vis this experience that I had, which lasted almost 20 years. I really break the book down, I guess you could say, into three areas, or I have three objectives in writing this book. The first was really kind of on a macro level, just trying to identify for, either policymakers or business people, what were the enabling factors that led to the rapid rise, I may add, of China's digital economy. Looking at and reflecting on both the role of the government and the private sector. So that's kind of the first kind of aspect of the book. I'd say the second objective was really to provide an insider perspective, kind of pull back the curtain, so to speak, on Alibaba's management ethos and how it thinks from a leadership perspective. I really felt that this would be very helpful for entrepreneurs and business executives alike who are either building their own companies or really just trying to understand what are some learnings that can be gleaned from one of the most influential internet technology companies to come out of China. So that's what I call the secret sauce. And then the third aspect of the book is really more of a personal story. Me as a young executive, kind of moving from Palo Alto, California to Hangzhou at the time, 1999. And as we know, China in 1999 was very different. It had a per capita income of $800 per person, and I think they had about 8 million internet users at the time. And so this journey or experience, so to speak, really taught me in many ways kind of how technology can really impact society, particularly in emerging markets. But on top of that, I think there is another narrative that sort of is intertwined, which is really this Eastern philosophy that kind of really governed many of the kind of the approaches that Alibaba used in its own development. And that's partly why I call this book The Tao of Alibaba. The Tao is really this thematic sort of thread that you'll see in the book. And as we all know, Tao is kind of a Chinese philosophical sort of, a set of beliefs that we kind of hear day in, day out, the Tao of this, the Tao of that. But if I kind of simplify it and break it down, I talk about three aspects. It's this concept of a path or a way, which is sort of, you can apply it to a company, you can apply it to individuals in their lives, but really finding that path as part of the driver of one's existence. The second aspect is harmony. So how does an organization sort of fit into the larger sort of context of the universe in terms of the dynamics taking place? And then the third aspect of the Tao that I talk about is this concept of embracing contradictions. And this is probably the most complex. I know you talk about it even in your own book, Matt, about this dialectic of East and West and the convergence of China and US in terms of its culture and its people. And so this concept of embracing contradictions in this dialectic runs throughout the book in terms of the company's management principles, how leaders think, but also kind of how we see the world today in terms of this East and West sort of, you can call it a convergence, also a collision, depending on the point of view. So that in a nutshell is kind of the book, and hopefully that gives a brief overview of kind of, what I talk about.
Great. Thanks so much, Brian. I kind of want to start very much at the beginning, even in the pre-Alibaba days. The heart of the book is about your experiences there and what you learned, but you did arrive in China initially as a master's student back in 1996, right. 97, went on to work as a market entry specialist at a sort of boutique consultancy. But this is very much not the kind of American management consultant, flying from one hotel boardroom to the next one. It's a much different world. In the book, you title that section Indiana Jones in a Business Suit, and you paint this nice picture of sort of careening through industrial small towns in China, quote, being ferried on the back of a whining motorcycle, clinging to a briefcase, my necktie flapping wildly in the breeze. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the China that you encountered back then, the places you were visiting, the type of work you were doing, the projects you were doing, and how those experiences shaped how you viewed the country and how you viewed working in the private sector, working in business.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, Matt. That was 1997. I had just graduated from the Hopkins Center, which was in Nanjing, which was the first educational joint venture between U.S. and China universities, Johns Hopkins University and Nanjing University. And I moved to Hong Kong, where I was based, thinking that, everyone was talking about management consulting as, a great job out of college or grad school. I had actually been on a track to looking at public health. I thought I was going to go pursue a career in trying to help save lives, but clearly I got a bit derailed. But I thought that management consulting might be a good way to learn what business was about. And it was really, as you mentioned, kind of the Wild West at that time. I think it was a moment where multinationals were very fascinated with China as a market, but it was still very much one where they were trying to set up operations to do manufacturing. China was very much still a kind of export-driven economy. In fact, it was still in its formative stages. So for me, in taking on the job, I spent very little time in Hong Kong and much more time, as you mentioned, on the back of motorcycles in Foshan or Shunde in southern China. I did projects looking at the nylon supply chain for a nylon filament manufacturer, understanding the whole extrusion process, then the weaving and knitting process, and then the apparel building process. I flew from Taiwan to parts of China and other parts of Asia to understand that whole system. And for me, what it showed or reflected was that there was a change taking place in Asia, where the West was setting up many of its businesses there, but to serve the larger global markets. But there was an information asymmetry. There was an asymmetry that was requiring young guys like me to literally go out there on the frontier and go door to door talking to factory manufacturers, trying to figure out how everything fit together. And then how did I find that information? I would literally go to trade shows and go booth to booth to talk to suppliers and manufacturers and try and piece this together, and then provide a report to companies like DuPont or, Danfoss. I did a big project around sewer pumps and understanding how these water pumps fit into these larger sort of construction projects. But that information was not very transparent, so to speak. You had to kind of piece it together. And so for me, it was an educational process. It was exciting. It was anything but the standard boardroom management consulting experience. But it was enthralling, it was thrilling. And I got to see on the front line how China was evolving thanks to investment, thanks to private sector. I mean, me, I came from a very liberal college. I always thought business was like a bad word. It was like where all the greedy people go to make money and extract, resources and exploit, labor. But I also saw, ironically, how society was changing and how, for the better, the infrastructure that was being built, the jobs that were being created. And so that was the start of kind of my China, adventure or career, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, those many of my most treasured memories from China take place, at the end of a journey on the back of a motorcycle too. So that part got me all nostalgic. So moving from there, 1997 Asian financial crisis hits, starting in Thailand, I believe, and spreading out the region. And really, it affects a lot of the jobs and the people that you were working with. So you end up back in California. You do a little bit of work in the public sector for Mayor Willie Brown. Right. And then you have an opportunity that comes up where you meet Jack Ma. And Jack Ma is obviously a very central character in the book because he's a central character in the story of Alibaba, just a totally and utterly unique person. I was wondering if you could describe that first meeting with Jack, your first impressions of him, and then how that led into your first role at Alibaba.
Sure. So, I was actually, as you mentioned, working in San Francisco at the time. I was the special assistant to Mayor Willie Brown as his special liaison to various districts, including the Richmond, I think Pac Heights and Chinatown. So it was a strange combination to try and represent, the city government. But growing up in Palo Alto and coming back from China, I guess I had the ability to kind of cover different parts of the city. But I was always interested in what was happening with regard to technology, just because growing up in the Bay Area, that was all around you, and you sort of understood that was just part of everyday life. And what I was very curious about was how technology was going to affect or impact the emerging markets. And so appreciating the value and impact of technology from a Silicon Valley standpoint, but looking towards these emerging markets really kind of kept it maintained a curiosity in terms of what was happening abroad. And when Jack came to San Francisco, he was introduced through a mutual friend, actually Joseph Tsai, who was the vice chair now of Alibaba. Joe was taking him to Silicon Valley to do a fundraising. And I think he met with 30 VCs at the time. And he didn't raise a single dollar on that trip, which, you look back now, it's surprising, but it's also understandable because at the time it was still such a nascent company. I don't think they had more than 40 people. And I met Jack at the St. Francis Hotel. And what struck me about Jack was the charisma, the energy he had for the idea that he was trying to pursue. And I had looked at a number of companies at that time, Sina and a few other Chinese internet companies that were starting to emerge. But one of the things that really struck me about Alibaba was its linkage to trade and commerce. And I think that while at that time, information portals were very much the thing, I asked myself, how does this link to the experience I had as a management consultant? What problem is it actually solving? And can it actually do good for the society through the services it's providing? And Jack seemed so confident at the time about what he was doing. And he had, a very strong partner in that process because I knew about Joe's background. But it was obviously a big gamble, rolling the dice. But I immediately saw the potential, and I saw that Jack was someone who had this charisma about him. So I made the decision to leave San Francisco and move to Hangzhou. And that was a very, very unique experience for that time to leave the comforts of San Francisco and then go to the outskirts of Hangzhou, which was very much still being built. I talk about my time at that time is kind of equivalent to living on a construction site, because everywhere around you, there were new buildings being, constructed. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Jack, extremely unique individual. And you mentioned the charisma there. I've only had the chance to sort of be in the same room with him once and listen to him talk. It's just pure magnetism. There's just something where all eyes in the room immediately gravitate towards him. You just want to hear what he has to say. And it seems like that really did a lot of work in the early days of Alibaba and just kind of getting things moving.
Yeah, and he had a very different view from the typical entrepreneur at that time, because many of the Chinese entrepreneurs, as you'll recall, were returnees from MIT, from Stanford, or various, Western institutions. Jack had no Western education at all, with the exception of a trip to Australia as a young man. But he saw something, and he was so confident about it in a way that he said, we're going to do things different from the typical sort of, internet company, because I've tried this in the past and I know that there is this need. And he was really focusing at the time on these small businesses, which most people were ignoring. You'll remember that, it's not the first time a technology company tried to pursue small businesses, but the problem was there's so little money that they had to spend on services that it was a very challenging endeavor. But I think Jack was so close, living in Zhejiang, in Hangzhou, to the SMEs. He understood there was a very big need for what he was trying to do.
Yeah. So, your life, you've had very much a front row seat to Silicon Valley's development, just growing up in Palo Alto, being in the region, and then obviously a front row and a hands-on seat to the development of China's tech and innovation ecosystem. And in the book, you talk about your ambitions for bridging these worlds. And when you're first heading back to Hangzhou, or heading to Hangzhou to take up this role, you write that you, quote, "I wanted to help bring some of Silicon Valley's ethos of innovation and entrepreneurship to China. Little did I know it would be China bringing that spirit to me." Kind of a reversal, going in with the idea that you're going to bring some of the secret sauce that is, unique to Silicon Valley, and then discovering that there's something else on offer there. There's already something developing there. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the relationship between Silicon Valley and China at that time. How did people in Silicon Valley view China, and what did they get wrong, or what did they miss? Sure.
No. So, I think at the time, Matt, and this is an ongoing, I think, topic that deserves conversation, because there's a lot to be learned on both sides. It was a humbling experience, to be honest, to go from Silicon Valley to China, thinking that I had something so valuable to offer. I mean, first of all, I'll put it into context. I wasn't a tech guy, even though I grew up in Palo Alto. So I hadn't done that much in the way of this whole tech experience, but I expected it to be like Silicon Valley in the way that my friends had described working at, Yahoo or eBay or whatnot. But I think that what they were hoping is that I could bring some ideas and relationships and even how we design product to the company. For me, it was much more of a learning in terms of understanding how China worked and understanding that China actually at the time only had about 30 years of business, sort of modern business sort of history at that point with the open door policy going through this whole communist sort of, change. And then becoming more of a market-driven economy. That was something that was very much noticeable because they weren't, on the one hand, and you compare that to America that had over 150 years of kind of business history and systems and processes, China was very much on the fly. And so the way that we were doing things, we thought, might be the Silicon Valley way, but they're very much kind of the Alibaba way, so to speak. And Jack brought ideas that were unique to how he saw things. We had a wuxia sort of company culture. Wuxia is this kung fu genre, like you see Jet Li and all these films flying around with the swordsman and whatnot. This is inspired by this kung fu author Louis Cha from Hong Kong that Jack really revered. But that also had an underdog spirit about it. It sort of inspired people to kind of fight the battle, to use technology to help small businesses. And so there were all these different aspects of kind of Chinese cultural kind of norms that were integrated into this Alibaba experience. And that was something that was eye-opening for me and kind of a learning experience. But also how the technology was applied, I think, was also very interesting. Jack was not a technologist. We talk about his first speech at Harvard Business School. He said Alibaba succeeded because it had no technology, no money, and no business plan. And to me, that sounded absurd. And I said, how are we possibly going to succeed? But what you realize is that Jack was focused on how to use technology to solve these problems that he saw around him with regard to Chinese, businesses, small businesses, and society as a whole. And so if you ask me sort of how that then applied to Silicon Valley, I think that it was refreshing in a way. It was a fresh look at how to use this technology revolution to address issues, to create value. And it was inspired by Silicon Valley from the onset. Jack always talks about how his first time in Silicon Valley, he observed, kind of how things were so vibrant and lively and the people that he met. And that was a great sort of role model for him in terms of how he approached his work. But then in a way, Alibaba and Jack and the team became their own in terms of how they approach these things. And I think that one thing that often happens, Silicon Valley is so good at the tech, they develop tech for the sake of tech and sometimes forget the bigger picture. And I always comment that it took me leaving Silicon Valley to really appreciate Silicon Valley, which is sort of an irony, but going to a place like China, an emerging market that started with very little and then created something of such high impact makes you realize just how much Silicon Valley has to offer the rest of the world. But what they have to do is kind of get out of the Silicon Valley bubble and realize that, okay, we're using world-class solutions to solve first world problems. What if we use these world-class solutions to solve, the developing world's problems? That impact can become even greater. And so that's a long way of answering your question, Matt, but just to say that the learnings work both ways and the time spent at Alibaba was extremely educational. And I think that that's also part of the reason or the motivation in writing this book is to kind of show these aspects of what Alibaba was able to do with very basic technology at the start.
In there, you referenced that quote from Jack Ma about, the ingredients to success were no business plan, no money, and no something else that it sounds
no
like
technology. Yeah.
No technology, no business plan. And I think it gets at one aspect of the Tao of Alibaba as you lay it out. You kind of gave us a lot of the principles there in the opening, but I wanted to zoom in on one of them that I think kind of is woven throughout the book in many places, which is improvisation. It's just the ability to sort of pivot, the ability to work on the fly. You describe, especially in those early days, things feel very chaotic. They feel very, unplanned. They feel very improvisatory. You might spend 3 weeks crashing on a project that at the very last minute, they just decide to shelve it and replace it with a totally different product.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could, talk about the role that improvisation played in Alibaba's growth at the beginning, and then also how do you think that sort of changed or didn't change over time? How do you maintain some of that, the good parts of that culture as you scale up from a 40-person company to one of the biggest companies in the world?
Yeah, I'll admit the improvisation is something that was quite. You could say it was frustrating in the early days. There's a lot of trial and error, and sometimes you wonder, do we even know what we're doing? And Jack says starting Alibaba was like a blind man riding on the back of a blind tiger. Like the kind of experiences, you couldn't plan things out, and it was very much chaotic. But that was also a sign of the times. China was the fastest growing economy at the time, and the internet was the fastest growing industry at the time, and you're kind of at the eye of the storm. But I think that one of the key things that really allowed us or Alibaba to succeed in spite of all that was this strong kind of focus on a mission and a vision. And Jack would talk about that incessantly and to the point of ad nauseum. But it was, you realize the reason he did it was so important for the company and its existence. And the early days, everyone that joined the company might not have had a fancy college degree. They might not have graduated from Tsinghua or Stanford or whatnot, but they definitely believed in what the company was trying to do, which was, help these small businesses or help create an equal playing field for those who are not part of the mainstream economy. And so this start and stop, we had many projects that we thought were the right approach. And like you said, just before the launch or after months of work, we sort of shut them down. But there were also times when experiments were a surprising success. And, one of the more recent ones was this Yuebao, which is this money market fund that some of the Ant Financial employees created as a way to store excess funds in a wallet. And, that money market fund within 9 months became kind of one of the largest money market funds in the world, really just as a result of these engineers trying to create something of convenience for their customers to store funds and get interest, as opposed to not have the benefit of that interest-bearing account. But it was such a high interest rate because of the efficiencies that they created in the setup that everybody's cash started to flow into this money market fund. There are other examples. I guess you could say that the evolution of Alibaba in a way was sort of trial and error, because it started out with e-commerce, but then the payments, Alipay, was created to facilitate the problems of trust. And then, the Ali Cloud was really because there was a concern that the computing requirements were going to be so high that we needed to have our own cloud computing system. Otherwise, the company would go bankrupt. But Jack, he will admit, he didn't know how it would turn out. He didn't even know if it was the right, technically he didn't understand all the nuances. And there was, I don't write about this in the book, but I can tell you here that there was actually competing teams when they built Ali Cloud. I think the open source code was called Drupal, and then there was a Aspera, which was the sort of the company's own cloud computing proprietary software, and they had two teams competing with one another internally. You can say that's a huge waste of resources. But what it also allowed them to do is create kind of these contingencies. If one didn't work, then they still had another sort of approach to it. But the best solution came out in it, and that's why Ali Cloud is such a formidable sort of company today, because they actually were an early mover in an area that was critical to the digital infrastructure in China. So these are some of the examples of how this sort of improvisation worked, but there's plenty more that we could talk about. And it is a hallmark of the company, but this is also why the company has a value called embrace change, which is now change is the only constant. And I also talk about the importance of company values in the book, because that's what conditions the team to be ready to adapt to this improvisation, but also not in a way you have to prepare yourself mentally, because change is not something that most people enjoy, especially when they're trying to do a job well.
Yeah. I like that the metaphor of the blind man riding the blind tiger. I mean, it maps very well onto just China's broader sort of socioeconomic development over this 3+ decades of reform and opening. There's so much raw energy pent up in the system. There's so much economic energy that's kind of waiting to get out there, that if you're trying to map it all out and, set your 5-10 year plan and then execute on it, you're going to miss out on all the opportunities that come up along the way. But yeah, it's, if I could give one skill to like someone who wants to be a Chinese entrepreneur in the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, it's improvisation. That's the one that'll get you somewhere. In terms of the sort of the management philosophy, you talk a fair amount about this blending of East and West, and Jack specifically speaks about the blending. What is it? It's infusing Western management with Chinese philosophy, a blending of East and West. You use various metaphors around Tai Chi and other areas. You give examples of when that blend worked well, and you also give examples of when it didn't work well, or when there was friction around the edges. And you specifically talk about the situation with Yahoo. Yahoo acquires a 40% stake in Alibaba relatively early on, and it's celebrated as this great win, this kind of coming out party. Finally, Alibaba is connected to a truly world-leading technology company, and these synergies that are going to happen. But the fallout, it didn't pan out that way. And I was wondering if you could talk about that situation, that process, and what you learned from it.
Yeah, that was a very interesting time, because as a Bay Area guy, I was so excited about the merger of these two companies. And it was a complex transaction, because if you read the Western headlines, it was, Yahoo acquires 40% of Alibaba through $1 billion investment. And then if you read the Chinese headlines, is Alibaba acquires Yahoo because they actually, as part of the deal, acquired Yahoo China and all its operations, in addition to the $1 billion cash infusion. So it was actually both. It just depended on what side of the ocean you were on. And it was also an attempt, like you said, to bring together, two great companies. We very much admired and looked up to Yahoo at that time, and knew that there was a lot to learn. But it was also this clash of kind of cultures and mindsets. And there were so many talented individuals that came to Alibaba after that transaction. Some came from the Yahoo side. Some people were hired kind of from the outside, but very, very qualified with all the credentials. But what struck me as very strange is so many of them, after a year or two, ended up leaving the company. And it was very difficult for them to integrate, because there were, I think for many of these professionals, including myself, there was a belief that there are set ways of doing things. And this maybe gets back to the improvisation aspect. And I will add that I even left Alibaba after 2 years to go get an MBA, thinking that I needed to learn these skills to then apply to become a better, leader and contributor to the organization. When I returned many years later. But, even in 2005, this is, 6 years after the company was started. I mean, and granted, that's still a young company, but, you would have thought that it had kind of adapted and matured into kind of a more international sort of type of organization. And it was international, but it was still very much kind of Alibaba. And I think it's a unique culture. And I think that what that East and West sort of dynamic showed is that there are things that I think, at least with regard to Alibaba, are unique to the organization. The Eastern philosophy, we can talk about some of these Taoist principles about this dialectic, and it's not about it's just that way or this way. It's actually both, right? And how do you adjust? How do you calibrate based on the situation? And I don't think that's a comfortable thing for a lot of people who come from a traditional business background. They talk about in the West reductionism This philosophy is about consistency and always looking for the same thing over and over and over. But when it comes to Eastern philosophy, they talk about holism, which is balance, right? And so it's like, when you need a little bit more entrepreneurial kind of versus more kind of professional, when you need a little bit more of, sort of a Western practice versus an Eastern practice. And I think that this is something very difficult for even like Americans like myself to understand. And it's taken me decades. I mean, as I was writing the book, I was starting to finally understand this dynamic. But some people will say, when you're dealing with Chinese businesses, they're always changing their mind. But I think from a Chinese business, it's about survival and adaptation. So I think that gets to some of the elements that were at play. But I also think there's something even more profound. If you talk about the coexistence of contradictions, Alibaba, Jack would always say, is a business that has a charitable heart but uses business techniques to fulfill its goals. And for the longest time, when I studied my MBA, we were still very much focused on Milton Friedman's Chicago sort of school of thought of maximizing shareholder value. That's what corporations exist for, and the whole sort of social impact side was kind of CSR. It was kind of nice to have. But Jack always talked about how Alibaba was created to solve these problems, and in 2007, our first time that we went public in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, he made a speech where he said, customer first, employee second, shareholder third. And the analysts and the investment bankers were like, this is crazy. Like, of course, it's the other way around. And I think that what Jack has proven, and I talk about this in my book as well, is that business can actually be used for good. It can be highly profitable, but highly effective in affecting positive change within societies. And to me, that was also this, I don't know if you call it East-West, but it's very much Alibaba and kind of my traditional business thinking, how those two disparities kind of came to resolution. And so I think that many of these things were new for many of us who were at the company. And I think it came more to a head when you had the Yahoo deal.
Yeah. There's so many parts of that sort of resonate with things I've seen or experienced over there. I think, especially in the clash of cultures of merging the sort of the beachhead of a foreign company in China with a homegrown Chinese startup, and that usually the people who rise to the top of a sort of a foreign beachhead are people who are essentially, high achievers. They know what to do. They best grades, top of their class, hired into the best jobs, and they can manage. They can manage things. But someone like Jack, that's not his model at all. He's fundamentally like a fighter, a scrappy, wise, but very nimble and an underdog. And when you try to merge people who are used to essentially sort of carrying out orders and managing versus somebody who's used to fighting for everything, it's just that's not usually going to be a fair fight.
Matt, Jack used to say the best way to identify your leaders in a company is throw them in the battlefield and see who comes back alive. Then they are your top leaders. There's nowhere more stark than that. And you're right. It was sort of that street smart kind of scrappiness that actually is what the company needed at that stage. And those who had gone through experiences, those who had, rather than just do what you're told or do what you're supposed to do based on kind of the standard practice, it's about encountering situations like you've never had before and figuring out how to deal with it. So you're absolutely right. And look, I will say that in today's Alibaba, things may have evolved. Like there's still, you asked me this actually in the question, I should answer it. How do you keep a company constantly nimble and innovative when it reaches a size that it is now, almost 250,000 employees? And I would say that to some extent, there are those who are more professional because the company's evolved and those businesses are more mature. So you're going to want the kinds of people that we had coming in from Yahoo back in 2005, because they are there to make sure that things are run properly and, following, all the different standard practices that are required to keep a company going of that size. But then at the same time, there is a need to innovate. And I would say that Alibaba has done that in many different stages of its time by using unique management or organizational structures where they'll literally break up these large kind of silos into small, nimble business units, and then manage through a council versus like one-to-one. And they have maybe the CEO, and then they'll have like a group of people who are in charge of different areas, but then they also have the business heads that report into them in this council. Sometimes even at some point they rotate them, right, in terms of who takes on the leadership of that council. And so there are very innovative ways that Alibaba has been able to keep the entrepreneurial spirit alive. But I also think part of it too relates to the culture that they instill through the values, which remains an important part of the organization.
I'm going to kind of move us along the timeline a bit here to get us a little bit more closer to the present day, and then going to go to audience questions after this one. Okay. But as sort of one final question for you to get into some of the international work that you did later on in the company, you talk about in 2012-13, you spent a couple of years away from the company as a CEO of another company in Hong Kong, kind of doing your own thing. And when that business ends up getting sold, you sort of start going back and talking to mentors, including Jack, looking for a little bit of direction. And you have an interesting story about the advice he gave you, where that sort of took you and how that eventually led you back towards Alibaba for some international adventures. So when you went back to Jack after that, and what advice did he give you, and where did that take you?
Well, normally when you go to see a mentor and you ask for advice, you expect him or her to say, well, you're interested in this and that field, you should talk to so-and-so and maybe they can give you a job, right? That's the pretty much the more straightforward way of mentoring someone or giving the advice. When I went to see Jack, I was like, I'm not feeling like what I'm doing has the meaning and the purpose that I once believed in. What is your advice? He said, go to the poorest part of China, find a rural area and just stay there. And make sure you're uncomfortable. And he said, if you're comfortable there, then move and go somewhere even worse and stay there. And once you feel very uncomfortable, stay longer. And I said, okay, and then what? And he said, then come back and talk to me. And I couldn't understand what on earth he was trying to get at. But I actually did it. I actually went to Guizhou. And I think there's probably worse places to visit in China, but it was one of the poorest provinces in the country. But it's beautiful because it has lush green mountains and just not a lot of industry that's there for wealth creation. And I went into villages and lived in places that you can't get to by car, and stayed for like a week or so. And one of the things that impressed me on my tour there was these villages, how empty they were. And these were what they now call hallowed villages, where you had these young infants and elderly people taking care of the infants. And I would go to some of these different events they had, and it was depressing because basically they even had some performances. I think, I forgot what time of year it was, but some festivals. And it was these old people dressed up and then the babies being held by these grandparents in the audience. And what I realized is most of the working age people had left the villages. They'd gone to the cities, like we see so many times in these Chinese cities, people, as waiters, as construction laborers, as helpers, nannies for families in the cities. They're going to the cities to find work. And as a result, you have this huge collapse of the rural communities, but also the cities are being inundated and infrastructure is being stressed because of this large influx. And I asked myself at that point, because I was a bit almost heartbroken to see what was happening in the villages. What can one do to help these people? Because China was clearly on the upswing in terms of its economic growth, yet it wasn't reaching these people. And so it turns out that, I still had a lot of contacts with friends at Alibaba at that time. And after I had visited this Guizhou, I met with some of them. And one of them actually said, well, what you're describing is a phenomenon that is a big issue in China. But strangely enough, we've discovered this phenomenon where people in these villages are actually utilizing e-commerce to actually create wealth in the villages. And you should go visit these places. And one of them was a village in Jiangsu province called the Shaji Township, Dongfeng Village. And this young man named Sun Han was this example of someone who had brought e-commerce to his village in what was literally in the past a garbage village. It was a village where they would actually deliver or bring all the trash that was being imported from Japan and the United States and Europe, and they would actually kind of separate it out for recycling purposes. Sun Han would say how the village used to smell like burning plastic, and even the creeks alongside where he'd walk were black because of the pollution. He essentially brought back an idea to do DIY furniture in his village after spending some time in the city, going to school, and then dropping out and trying other businesses. He discovered that the internet and e-commerce was actually a viable approach. And he was able to create a cluster of small businesses in his village, facilitated by Taobao, to create a DIY furniture cluster, which today now employs probably half of the township, and it's hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. It's probably one of the biggest clusters for manufacturing of DIY furniture. And so when I learned about this, it was still kind of growing. It wasn't what it is today, but that got me very excited. And that's when I returned to see Jack, and I told him how, this is something that I can really be passionate about. It turns out that Jack also was about to start his IPO process for 2014. And so he needed someone to help him in that regard. But really for me, it was this idea that you can help a society through in a profound way using technology. And this village phenomenon, I think, was something that got me very, very motivated. So yeah, that is the turning point or the catalyst for me in the experience.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm going to start going to some audience questions here. And the first one that we've got is very simple. It's, could an Alibaba be started now in China? There's probably a lot behind that question. There's political currents, sort of multi-year, some people call it a crackdown on tech. Some people call it a rectification, a regulatory firestorm. There's all those issues. There's also just the issue that there are so many more mature and very big and powerful Chinese internet companies that it might be harder for a scrappy start to come out. What's your read?
Yeah, I mean, my direct answer is no. Not an Alibaba, but and the reason being that there's a time and place for all of these types of phenomenon to come of age. And if you read the first part of the book, I go through all the different building blocks that contributed to an enabling environment for the digital economy growth in China. And there was absolutely the right conditions at that time, whether it's the stage in economic development of China itself, or the government policies that kind of led to this late touch approach of technology, and many other things. It's not to say that there isn't room for a phenomenon of other types of companies to emerge that could have an equal impact. But they're going to be in different industries. The internet as we know it kind of had its moment, but everybody is talking about Web3 as the next iteration, right? Is that going to happen in China, or is that going to happen somewhere else, is a big question. But I think if you look at digital economy as it relates to commerce and how it facilitates things, there is definitely room in other countries, particularly in the regions like Africa. I think that if you look at Southeast Asia, what's happened there, and Matt, you studied this as well, countries like Indonesia and India have had, similar evolutions, but at a much faster rate. They've been inspired by Silicon Valley, but they've also been inspired by China in the models that have emerged there. So the question would really be, where are the enabling environments today, and where is that opportunity to replicate something like Alibaba, which I think is what gets me excited even today in looking at the other emerging markets, because we're fortunate to have a blueprint for what happened in a country that had very little. And there are many countries in places like Africa that have very little, but have great need. And this is part of what I spent my time at the last few years while at Alibaba doing, is trying to share these lessons with African and Southeast Asian and Latin American entrepreneurs to say, what can you learn from what Alibaba did? Because for someone to say this is impossible is completely misleading, because Jack was an English teacher. He was in a country, as I mentioned, that had a very low per capita income, very little in the way of internet users, yet he was able to create something as impactful as Alibaba. So how do you create the right conditions for that in other countries? And this is, entrepreneurs play a role, but also governments. Part of what I was hoping in this book is that governments would also, some people would read these, the different aspects that I talk about in this book and think about how government policy can actually better facilitate entrepreneurial success in whatever country they're in. So it's a public-private sort of partnership that's required, but entrepreneurs play a critical role in building this ecosystem.
Just one follow-on in terms of sort of preaching this gospel of Alibaba and how it made its way in these places. How would you describe the kind of the receptivity or the interest? I think sometimes in the U.S. there's still even a little bit of resistance to the idea of learning from China in any sort of meaningful way. How would you describe the reception in these places?
In these places being the emerging markets or in the U.S.?
Emerging markets, emerging markets, yeah.
I think it's very different. And I think this is something that we need to wake up to as Americans, to realize that the world is changing. And the solutions now are no longer, just coming from America or Silicon Valley. We do not have a monopoly, I guess, on the answers to some of these societal problems. And therefore, it's incumbent on us to also study what's happening in places like China. But I would say that in countries like, or regions like Southeast Asia, the conditions in those countries are much more similar to China than the US. Therefore, there is an affinity to thinking about, well, how can payments help me address the unbanked population issue? How does e-commerce help me solve my access to products and services in a rural community, right? I mean, people literally came from different countries to visit these villages that we talked about, these what they call Taobao villages, to see how the phenomenon was created. And what you also see, there's a whole informal economy that exists in many of these countries. And one of the amazing things about digital payments is that it's able to formalize informal economies by bringing them into the sort of mainstream, giving them banking services, giving them access to procurement services, giving them even lending. The whole phenomenon of microfinance has just exploded. And what that does for these street merchants or for these farmers is game changing, right? And a lot of that can be sort of inspired from sort of the examples that I talked about that emerged from China. So I would say they're more open-minded to it. They're borrowing from each, the U.S. and China, and then finding what works best for their needs.
Great. I'm going to try to get in two more questions here before we end in just about 10 minutes. The first one, an audience question here. Again, quite simple. What does Alibaba look like today, and is Jack Ma still involved? This is a very live question, I think, a very rapidly evolving one. So I'll see what you have to say on that.
Okay. So the question is, what is the situation with Alibaba?
Yeah, what does Alibaba look like today? Is Jack Ma still involved?
Okay. So obviously Alibaba is still very much a dynamic company that's evolving with the times and the needs. It's been a difficult 3 years, I think, in terms of policy. and how government is regulating sort of certain areas. And I'd say that this isn't unique to China. It's actually globally, there's been a growing concern about big tech and kind of its impact on kind of the larger society, antitrust, monopoly, these types of things, just because size-wise has just grown very quickly. I think that it's just that whether it's the United States, Europe, or China, the methodology has been different, and so we've seen some of that impact on Chinese internet companies. Nevertheless, I think that there is absolutely a role for these companies, not only in kind of continuing the commercial, the e-commerce aspects, but also in new areas. Industrial internet, I think, is a very important area. How do you kind of move from just the sales and marketing side to actually manufacturing to make it more efficient? I think that's an area that Alibaba is continuing to grow and develop. Cloud computing is also obviously the engine for the digital economy. So whether it's large companies or small businesses, I think that is an area that will continue to be very important. And then there's a bunch of newer areas that are emerging, metaverse and blockchain, et cetera. So that's all happening. It's quite dynamic. In terms of Jack's involvement, he's officially retired. So I think he's leaving it for the next generation. And he's, I think, very much interested and curious about new things. There's been talk about agritech is something he's looking at, but also philanthropy. He's using a lot of his past experience to enable entrepreneurs in other parts of the world, also helping the rural communities in education in China. I think he's got plenty on his plate, and hopefully, we'll be seeing some of that come to fruition as we move forward.
All right. I think we've got just time for maybe one more question here, which is another straightforward one. What is the number one lesson that other companies can or should learn from Alibaba's culture? I know you've got decades of experience, tons of lessons. You're being asked to boil it down. So, even it doesn't have to be the number one, but a top lesson that you felt that you learned over time there from Alibaba's culture that you think can be applied more broadly.
Hopefully this isn't controversial, but I truly believe that what makes Alibaba so unique is its ability to link work in with your life. And Jack would say things like Alibaba is, Jack would say, life is work and work is life. And we even Alibaba has a value that says to work happily and live seriously. And what that means is it's very important to think about before anybody takes a job, what kind of life they want to live. What is the life of purpose, life of meaning, and then figure out how your work fits into that. And so there's a lot of complaint and criticism of things like 996, which is 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. That was kind of something that came up in the news because people were feeling overworked, and obviously this is the common for the audience. This is a common stock phrase in China that you work 996, 9 days a week, 6 days a week, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And exactly. It became almost like a workforce meme about overwork in tech companies. Yeah, exactly. And by the way, it's not like Silicon Valley people don't grind it out. Like that's always been a hallmark of just a startup life, right? But the question is should you make that a requirement of people's everyday sort of routine? And I don't think it should be. I talk about that in the book as well. But the point of all this is that if you find something that resonates with your greater life purpose and it's part of your day-to-day work, it's not going to be work. It's going to be something that you would love to do anyhow. And I think that in the time that I worked at the company, it very much was instilled within us that we're all there. And I think it was a powerful force that allowed the company to be so successful in spite of the odds that were against us. And I think that is probably something that I've taken away that I would like to apply to future companies that I, try and create, or advise entrepreneurs. And, maybe it sounds a bit Pollyannish or whatnot, but I do believe this because, and I didn't believe it for certain points. That's why I left the company and did other things. But I kept coming back to this because ultimately for my life, which is kind of that conversation I recapped when I saw Jack and went to Guizhou, that's why in my everyday life, I exist for a purpose, and I'm trying to find things that will help enhance and kind of forward that own personal life mission. And that's how work fits into this. So to me, that was my greatest lesson that I took away from my Alibaba time.
Yeah, purpose-driven work. It's true that this almost feels like it's gone sort of out of fashion in a way. The idea of work-life balance, where the move is primarily to push work out of life and sort of have these two separate zones. It seems to be a little bit more of the going, of the popular approach at the moment. But that seems like a valuable lesson there. I think we still do have a couple minutes left, so I might just throw in one or two of my own questions here at the end. I guess maybe if you could tell us a little bit more about what you're up to now. You've been busy the last few years working on founding Radii and then working on the book. I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit about these different projects and how you sort of see them coming together in your own work.
Sure. No, thanks for asking, Matt. For me, all this is, as I referenced what I just answered in your last question, is all very much part of my kind of life mission. I originally, and I still believe that what I want to do is to focus on something that will have the greatest benefit to the greatest number of people, right? Very utilitarian, I guess you would say, but greatest good for the greatest number. And I thought that would be through healthcare. And then I realized technology can have a massive impact on society for the good, better of society. And so since leaving Alibaba, I've wanted to do the same. And part of that is encapsulating the lessons that we just talked about through the book. And then hopefully that will, reach many people in many parts of the world. I still teach a course, also an entrepreneurship course with the Alibaba Global Initiatives, but writing a book, I think, will allow that all to be captured into this in one efficient way. But Radii, RADII, is how we spell it, radii.co, is a sort of a media platform that I've created to tell stories about sort of Chinese youth culture, whether from China or kind of the larger diaspora. But I think what's really important is that we continue to understand, each other from a people-to-people basis, understanding how cultures evolve, kind of what makes us similar, what makes us different, but also humanize, each other. And I think that one of the biggest concerns that I saw and see even more so now in terms of the rhetoric that happens at the high levels in governments, but also mainstream media, is that things get overly simplified and there is a polarization and a demonization of countries and people that can push us too far in a certain direction. I'm very cognizant of the reasons why concerns exist, whether it's competitiveness, technology, economy, et cetera. But we shouldn't lose the bigger picture. And I think this is work that you've done, Matt, as well, both at the Carnegie Foundation, but also in your writing, is trying to help understand one another through human stories, but also nuanced conversations, right? There's so much benefit that can come from the technology that both the US and China are creating to address the larger issues that we talk about, wealth inequality being one, but also climate change, which I think you did work at Paulson Institute. They do a lot in that area, but also disease prevention and food security. We actually have on hand the solutions, or within reach, the solutions to solving many of these issues kind of on an incremental basis and long-term, hopefully fundamentally, if we just kind of collaborate in those areas that matter. And some of the greatest breakthroughs in terms of technology and research have come as a result of US-China collaboration. So I think that the rest of the world is kind of looking from afar, thinking, geez, if these two guys can't get along, then what's in it for the rest of us? And there is obviously growing pressure for countries to take sides. But I think most countries with a rational mind would not want to have to take a side. Instead, they would like to get the benefits from both. And as I mentioned earlier, I see that happening to some extent within regional sort of digital economy models. But the more we push this to a level where you have to make choices, the more likely we are to kind of harm ourselves in the longer run and in the bigger picture. So that to me is how I'm spending my time, is whatever I can do on a small incremental basis to kind of facilitate that conversation.
Great. I think that's a perfect place to stop.
Okay.
Thanks so much to Brian Wong, longtime executive at Alibaba and author of the new book, The Tao of Alibaba, Inside the Chinese Digital Giant That is Changing the World. Thanks, Tim, for joining us. And also thank you to the audience for watching along and participating. If you'd like to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club in efforts in making virtual programming, please visit commonwealthclub.org/online. Thank you very much, and have a good night.